Hi, I'm Fabian, and I'm here to present a framework for ethical reasoning that was introduced to me by Danny Sheehan. This is dedicated to a group, Future Law, people that concern themselves with policy making, change making, and in generally engineering the future of law, the future of our systems, how we govern ourselves. We have a bunch of legal frameworks and political systems that are a little bit in a perhaps a disarray, to say it mildly. And I want to provide this framework as something that we can use as a certain, like a head-up display, like a kind of an interface for our mind, how to look through the world in a principled manner that allows us to reason from first principles, become aware of our own assumptions, and understand how our assumptions may be different from somebody else's, and how different assumptions lead to different conclusions, different interpretations, different understandings. And it's not as much, in the first step, it's not as much about discussing what is right or what is wrong, but the first step, in my opinion, has to be that we facilitate a dialogue, that we understand each other's perspectives, that we understand the motivations, that we recognize principles where they're operative, so that we can communicate to each other in a way which our counterparty is native to, like something that they can make sense. Otherwise, we're just talking to a wall, pretty much. Now, let me share the link. I think it should be live. All right, here we go. And so we continue. So, Danny was introduced to me by a friend as one of the heaviest attorneys on the planet, and if you look at his track record, it's truly impressive. He's pretty much has half a century of litigation experience now. He studied at Harvard Law and then became a constitutional trial lawyer, a case lawyer. And I met him the first time in California, and he released a book at the time in Santa Cruz. And briefly after that, through a mutual friend, I got to encounter him in a private context where, yeah, that's my relationship to him. Most of the content that I will present here is condensation, a filtering down of content that is readily available on his website. He has many of his classes from UC Santa Cruz available online, so I encourage you to go and examine those in depth. There's two versions of Trajectory of Justice, Rulers of the Realm, People's Advocate, and I think one is the Public Intellectual. Really, really amazing work, especially the focus on, in this case, it's about the US Constitution. Now, my sense is that the US Constitution is interesting because it's fairly concise, and in many ways it has become a kind of the blueprint after which many of the other nations orient themselves. In my opinion, since the French Revolution, we are stuck midway in a somewhat it's a bit of an incomplete revolution in the sense of the Europeans chose to get rid of their kings, flawed as some of them may have been. However, kings had certain functions, and these historical authoritative systems, they were set up in a particular way that the new systems were not necessarily able to cover the whole spectrum. And this has been, I'd say, a little bit of a challenge in a sense of when we have an incomplete legal framework, then it's subject to coercion, distortion, misuse, or even abuse. What I've observed today is that many lawyers are trained often in a somewhat a corporate setting, that many people are thinking in terms of corporations, meaning like for-profit entities, which are immunized against like the individuals that act on behalf are immunized towards liability, and the consequence of that is a bit if you remove the feedback. I understand the desire to protect against liability, but in a sense, what happens is that the feedback, the negative feedback of damage, is kind of cancelled out, because if you prioritize profit above everything else, then naturally you subordinate whatever other effects you end up generating, unless they contribute to your profit calculus. If you have a simple criteria, let's say you're here and you want to get there, point A to B, and what's the fastest way to get there? And you sit in a bulldozer, like the fastest way, if that's the only criteria for measurement, may just be to drive through a forest, because it brushes a bunch of things to the side, a bunch of animals and whatever else is in the way, and you achieve your purpose, because it does not account for the damage that is being caused. And we have now all sorts of patchworks where we try to make carbon credits, and then we require carbon credits, and then there's a market of carbon credits, and then while the basis for it maybe has been well intended at some point, it leads to erosion in the rainforest, like sometimes they're called the lungs of our planets, where you have a lot of vegetation growing, binding carbon from the atmosphere and releasing oxygen, gets eroded to farm cattle, and for cattle mainly to produce soy, deplete the ground, and then it's like, oh, well, now we have all this wasteland, and we can plant trees, and then trees give us points so that we can sell it as credit. So obviously this is kind of absurd to that's a viable business model, and that is always the case when we try to. I mean, probably the same could be said about tax laws. If wherever something is dammed in, the ones that have substantial capital available will be able to first structure around those limitations, and then, which is one issue, but then the much bigger issue is that we have this interfacing between the political apparatus and the corporations, where since in the US, since Citizens United, the corporations can donate to the campaigns of politicians, and therefore by basically getting politicians elected that then instinctively start to act out and operate on behalf of the interests of the corporations and not the people. And like this, to me, seems more of a structural problem. It's not necessarily that there's the issue with people, individuals, right? It's like if the system structures the incentives in a certain way, that you have selection pressures which promote people which will either adhere to a particular worldview, or what seems to become even more common, to reject any particular worldview altogether. Right? This is something that the postmodernists kind of have been advocating, that there's no such thing as truth. There's your opinion is as good as mine. There's nothing is fundamental. There's nothing is universal, which they themselves, of course, believe that there's no such thing as something absolutely true. They proclaim that should be taken as an absolute truth, at which point it becomes self-contradictory. This is something that Ken Wilber points out, among others. And so, in a way, that mode of reasoning is kind of inconsistent. It saws off its own leg. But the larger problem with this is, if there is no guiding principle, if everything is just random and aimless and pointless and devoid of any purpose and meaning, then it's almost a bit it presents almost a bit a nihilistic view. It's difficult to strive for something beyond individual self-gratification, sense of individual control and power and all that. And then the law becomes a mere tool to do whatever you want with it, without guiding principle, without any orientation towards a higher goal or purpose. And this, to me, seems not only unhealthy, but it actually seems quite dysfunctional in the larger context when we take a step back and say, like, wait, we came up with a law because I would say most of us would say something along the lines, we didn't want people to rule people, we wanted to have everyone to be equal before the law, and then there we wanted to articulate a certain set of rules by which we want to govern ourselves. Many spiritual traditions, East and West, they have their own set of laws that are kind of like propositions, right? If you want to have a harmonious community, you should find a way to limit selfish conduct, like killing and stealing and lying and like all these things that end up causing problems if a society on an instinctual level lashes out to these options. So we want to advocate a certain amount of self-restraint, to be disciplined, to be ethical, to be moral, to ultimately to be virtuous, to raise up towards a more noble way of being, to ascend, to raise up our sense of, not just our sense of self, but our sense of what we prioritize our conduct by, that we conduct ourselves, not just because it's good for us in a particular situation, but because we deem a particular cause of action to be desirable, even in the case, or perhaps especially in the case, where its implications are adverse to us. In an ideal world, we would find a way together where everyone that has to make a concession can do so, but cannot be forced. But you can voluntarily say, like, okay, I see I should give, like, let's say I have a lot of food, and objectively speaking, when I look at the environment, it would be sensible if I give up a part of that food to share it other, because everyone else would be better off, and for me the cost is less than the benefit for others, right? I know this may sound a little bit idealistic. I just want to paint a picture in what direction we could be headed by this. Now, Danny went already from law school. Before he passed the bar, he already did the Pentagon Papers case, where they published on the front page of the New York Times classified materials that basically kind of shut down the draft towards the Vietnam War, and showed that the story behind the scenes was not exactly what has been told publicly. And then he stumbled across John Rawls' book, A Theory of Justice, and he read it and made a bunch of notes up to himself, and then called him up and wanted to talk about him to him, because I guess many are familiar with this in this field, but I'm gonna recap it really quickly. That Rawls started out with the thesis that basically people are utilitarian, that people are doing because it's good for them, and that it's kind of like majoritarian utilitarian, right? If you have democracy, there's kind of like a mob rule mentality. If 51% gain an advantage from it, then you would assume that more than half vote for something, and then because that's the constraint, that's the rule which is set up for democracy, that becomes operational. Whether that is a good thing, I'm gonna put this to the side right now. I don't want to get distracted with my perspective on the merits and problems around democracies. I'm just going to say that I tend to side with Socrates here, that if you don't have a qualified, educated pool that makes an informed decision, it can very easily just become like the message gets just like what is the most mass of people that you can address. And if people don't have to be educated and don't have to actually assimilate the information, the best strategy is, you poke people what they're afraid of, what they have a strong emotional reactions, and you dumb down the message, so it just the majority of the population will respond to it. And that obviously is unlikely to really lead to refinement and advancement of our civilization as that requires insight, that requires understanding, that requires us to evaluate the conditions, its implications, weighing in different options. And these are very often complex decisions, and they should be approached as such, and not just whether you like blue or red or something like that. Anyway, so in the trajectory of justice, not the trajectory, sorry, Rawls in his theory of justice, he started out with this thesis and said like, well, that's basically, I'm just going to establish that that's how people operate and that's what becomes operational. But he found out that this is not actually always the case, that you have situations where there is no utilitarian benefit, that there are decisions where people have voted which seem, in a way, if you treat people as being simply utilitarian, they seem illogical. Like, for example, why do people want to contribute in a way, or the society to make choices to contribute and take care of, for example, paraplegic people? Maybe I pronounced this wrong, but people that are not of any immediate utilitarian value to the society. Now we can say like, well, but yeah, it's the right thing to do because we want to be kind to people, we want to take care of people that are challenged, that have difficulties and so on. But you cannot make the utilitarian argument. Rawls also looked at slavery and said like, it was to the utilitarian benefit that white people owned black people. And so since the white people were the only ones that were able to vote, how did it come about that they essentially went against this utilitarian interest and recognized, no, there's a deeper principle operating here, which in a way supersedes utilitarianism. And he called those the intuitionists. And these intuitionists, these people that somehow choose to pursue a course of action which they deem to be correct, that even necessary, even if they are exposing themselves, even if they risk their own liberty or safety, or some of them may even be confronted with the threat of prison or violence or financial penalties and all that. And yet, if this principle is developed strong enough, people will ultimately become like altruistic. People become willing to, in a sense of self-affirmation, to conduct themselves in a way what they deem to be moral, what they deem to be right. And it doesn't necessarily require some other authority to deem it moral, but it is something that people on an experiential level can arrive and develop and establish for themselves. What is particularly interesting, and he goes into this into some length, that there was a father, now I don't remember, I'll try to list his name in the description. There was a priest who was a professor for moral philosophy, which is kind of, you have normative ethics and then you have meta-ethics. And so moral philosophy is not the normative part, but it's more, let's say, the philosophical part on ethics. And he taught natural philosophy, which I believe goes back to the Scottish Enlightenment in Europe, and he taught this to James Madison, Alan Burr, and like quite a bunch of some of the first few Supreme Court justices, a bunch of Congress people, senators, and quite a substantial portion. Not everyone, right? There were certain people that were purely capitalistic, materialistic. They were more following from this ideology of kings and the ecclesial classes, that they believed that there's a need for a few to rule and essentially having the prerogative to exploit others. Now, I want to make this very clear. To me, a king or an authoritative leader is not implicitly a bad thing. The problem is just when it's not supervised by a higher principle, and selfishness like greed, exploitation, and these sort of things become dominant, it can become very harmful. And I think this is often missed in a political discourse. There's so much between left and right, but in the end you have left authoritarianism and right authoritarianism, and whether people want to choose Hitler or Stalin or Mao, they all seem like pretty bad options. But the problem is not that they're authoritarian. The problem is that their manifestation of leading or ruling with an authoritarian principle is disharmonious. It is not supervised by a higher principle that guides, governs, and shepherds towards a more natural, harmonious way of being. And then when he went back to the Harvard Divinity School, where he did his master's thesis under what's his name? It was Curt Parsons, the originator of the left-right bar graph. Now, I'm not a big fan of that, because left-right again seems to it goes implicitly in this dialectic, this polarized dualism between one team and the other, and that again is a very limited view. Obviously, we cannot have complex decisions and policies that have to account for and govern all sorts of competing dynamics and structure. With to a certain extent, it's about making benefiting from progress and enabling new technologies, and at the same time establishing certain safeguards to also have some assurance that not everything just becomes random and chaotic tomorrow, that we want to have a certain principle to orient ourselves towards. And that just to come down between blue or red or something like that is I mean, this is an absurd trivialization. And yeah, so Curt Parsons did a survey, an inductive survey over tens of thousands of people, where he, as opposed to a deductive reasoning, an inductive studies like you probe a large sample size, and then you see from the response that you get if you can discern any pattern. So you don't start with a theory, but you start with probing, and then from aggregating a large data set, you see if there are certain commonalities and some common principles. And what he noticed is that people clustered together in a kind of a group of people tends to give internally fairly similar answers, distinct from another group. And so his protege, Ralph Potter, was confronted with the question that, well, what makes you end up in one of these piles as opposed to another? Like, how are these people different? Because they come from all sorts of backgrounds, and they have all sorts of cultures and interests, and what makes people to achieve a certain amount of consistency in their reasoning, in their answers that they're giving, distinct from another group of people? And in the end, they kind of managed to narrow it down to what they call four fundamental pillar questions. So you have the cosmological questions: what is your assumptions over why is there something rather than nothing? The second pillar question is the teleological question, which deals with the question like, since there is something, and since this something is subject to change, right? The telos, that something is unfolding. Is there a discernible principle? Is there some sort of direction or some discernible principle by which this unfolds? Because we somehow, the next moment is not yet determined in the prior moment, and yet the one moment gives birth to the next moment. So it's also not that the next moment is just completely random and arbitrary. Otherwise, we couldn't orient or make sense or even have a dialogue. And so there are different assumptions, different cosmologies. Like some cosmologies say like, okay, there's something which explodes and dies. Others say like, well, there's something that explodes and then contracts. Others again say like, well, a cosmology, if it explodes, expands, and then expires and returns and contracts, maybe it goes the other way, and you end up with like a pulsation that it goes from Big Bang to Big Crunch to Big Bang to Big Crunch to, or maybe it's time that keeps pulsating once everything unfolds forward and then everything rolls backwards. And then there are more subtle possibilities. And I'm not trying to argue now for one or another. I'm just saying like there are different points of views, and some people also say like, well, but okay, it could be that before that there was nothing, but that doesn't seem very satisfactory. That this kind of this in the beginning there was nothing which exploded. It's like, well, okay, that seems a little bit like an incomplete story. Bernardo Kastrup says something like that. The historical origin can only have a transcendental cause. I mean, it's like you cannot keep going ad infinitum, backwards, because that kind of just defers the explanation, and eventually you need to make a step to like a meta plane and say like, well, but how is the whole thing born? But then when you go and say like, well, if there is some metaphysical realm or some undifferentiated sea of consciousness that gives birth to the manifested realm, could it have given birth to a different realm with different parameters? To which extent is what we observe simply internally consistent, or to which extent are certain properties compulsory, right? In physics, we have all sorts of numbers that we can't really explain. We have the cosmological inflation like lambda, we have the ratio between the electron and the proton, we have the strength between gravitational attraction and electromagnetism, we have the fine structure constant. These are all, they seem mysterious in the sense of, well, if they would have been a little different, then our universe would look very, very different. And very quickly, if you start messing a little bit around with those constants, then you end up with a universe which is not livable. But that is always explored from within the reality that we know. And so the question is there an alternative, internally consistent possibility? And what is the realm which would give birth to all sorts of possibilities? It could be that the human condition is just a special case in which we find ourselves in. That, for example, that we see, that we experience ourselves in 3 dimensions. I mean, I would say almost all of us agree that we can move around in 3 dimensions. But is this really a fundamental aspect of reality, or is this just how much we have explored so far? For example, we, for the longest time, I think the New York Times actually published, even after the Wright brothers took their first flight, they still said that the science has demonstrative proof that it's impossible to fly after they already did it. So, right, this is kind of like almost the point of denial. And it's very difficult to anticipate forward-looking what kind of technologies will become possible, and that also means what kind of safeguards are necessary, right? Energy, for example, we live in an entropic environment where we can have energy, an energy store, like a piece of wood. You could set it on fire and you free a bunch of energy and you can heat the environment. But eventually that heat dissipates and the system is stable because everything runs into entropy, and all the heat dissipates, you create equilibrium and things calm down. But if you reach to a generative stage, if you're able to generate more energy than you are dissipating, it becomes much more delicate to navigate the system so it remains stable, and especially that it remains safe. Right? This is a big issue in the domain of digital intelligence, for example. It's it's one thing to simply get a computer or some program to amplify something and to get very, very good at maximizing for a particular thing. It's a whole different story to keep that optimization process in check, to keep it as kind of supervised, or to impose or regulate it with the governor, so that you don't create a runaway algorithm, a runaway process, right? I mean, metaphorically, we could almost treat this a little bit like fire, right? If you just have like a bunch of, I don't know, rocks and sticks and ropes, you have a certain amount of things that you can do. But the moment you start something on fire, now you have something which can propagate itself, and it can actually grow, right? If you think of like a tribal village where there's just a bunch of let's say ropes and woods and roofs with leaves and basically organic material, I mean, maybe something can collapse if it's structurally not very sound. But the moment you introduce fire, then a building can catch on fire and set proximate buildings on fire, and maybe even set a forest on fire. So that before you understand and learn and master the technology of fire, it's very difficult to understand what, for example, what a safe distance is to build houses together, or what kind of materials you need to know, because some of them are more flammable and others not. So for these sort of things, we cannot ahead of time impose the rules and say, well, as long as we stick to those rules, then we're going to be safe, because the system itself is subject to change. And one thing that we would like to achieve in many of the legal frameworks around the world, something that lawyers are often concerned with, is like, how can you achieve a predictable legal outcome? Like to remove the arbitrary element of the equation, that you have a system that you have certain controls, and you can do this one thing, and even though the process may take a few steps to unfold, that it's not suddenly random of who ends up owning a particular right, but rather you make a choice and you take an action, and you have a reasonable amount of confidence that it will perform as you intend. Now, historically, we have this setup where on one level you have the body of the law, which is kind of like we have precedence cases, and we have examples, and we have rules that are always put in place for a certain for a particular reason, but that reason is not ahead of time, is not structured for all the possible range of scenarios that it's going to be applied towards. And so besides the body of the law, we have the spirit of the law, which is usually a judge, which says like, okay, I hear the argument on one side and I hear the argument on the other side, and okay, while you have like a very elegant way to kind of construct a kind of like a rationale that seems on its face rational, if you really start to go back and look at, well, why was this law passed in the world in the first place? Like, what was the purpose of it? What was the motivation behind it? What higher principle is it governed by? Then something that could seem rational in a sense of like that it's logically consistent, maybe you conclude that it's like, well, yes, but it completely violates some higher principles. Like, yes, okay, you can make all these choices, but they end up becoming, let's say, detrimental towards safety or harmony or some other aspect of life. Like, life is in its nature, part of life is that you have diversity, that there is variety. If we come and try to regulate life, that's essentially a sure way to ensure reducing variety and going towards death. For the mind, it may be very appealing of like, let's just get rid of all these differentiations and all this chaos and all this variety. It's just all too complicated. Let's just make simple rules and follow it like that. But very often that is at the expense of not only the richness of life, but also the evolution, the refinement of life. So implicit with life, there needs to be some degree of freedom. There needs to be some degree of diversity, of divergent, that enables the subjects to evolve, to refine, not to the extent where everything deteriorates in total chaos. Like it's healthy to have some sort of guidelines, but in a growing system where tomorrow always is becoming more complex than today, what kind of principles are desirable to be upheld and to be pursued? So we had the cosmological question, the teleological question, then we go to the ontological question, which deals with the nature of consciousness. So we find ourselves in this human form, like we somehow seem to be encountering our surroundings from behind our eyeballs. That's where we kind of by default our sense of sight is most of the time quite dominant, because it's very quick. It passes over a distance. But historically, like if you look at how life evolves, it hasn't always been like this in the past. Right? Essentially, the basic sense is a sense of heat. Right? If you have an amoeba, for example, it can sense heat. Maybe it can sense vibration, but it's a direct touch, a direct contact. And from heat, you have a differentiation between hot and cold, and maybe you can be sensitive towards pressure. And even audition is still something that happens in the inner ear. So if something happens, let's say, a rocket goes up, and like entertainment rocket now, to celebrate something, right? It goes up and explodes, and it takes a few seconds, or something would be with lightning, right? Until the shock wave, the sound wave, hits your eardrum, and then boom, you hear something. Whereas with vision is much faster. It's not immediate, but it's definitely much faster. The speed of light is much faster than the speed of sound. And so we became extremely reliant on vision, which in many ways it's a good thing, but it shouldn't be at the expense of the more elementary senses, because our spectrum of senses, for which we have developed different scientific apparatuses, from microscopes to telescopes to measures and scales, and we can see heat with the right apparatus. We can see, like, we have infrared, we have ultraviolet light, and now we have developed more sophisticated instruments that can measure gravitational and other sorts of displacements. So we have a lot of faculties, but the question is, is it possible that there are more than what we are aware of today? And this is kind of where this whole framework is going towards, because if you want to be a clear thinker, you at the minimum need to be internally consistent within your own assumptions, like your cosmological belief and your teleology about how that cosmology evolves, and the ontology, how consciousness relates to the material realm. There's this, I think it goes back to ancient China or somewhere in the East. It was a philosophical concept like this. In the West, I believe it was articulated by, was it Bergson or something like that, about if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Does it actually happen if nobody sees it, if nobody observes it? And the resolution to that is yes, because it happens. It doesn't happen in your mind or anyone else's mind, but it still happens in the cosmic mind, right? It's very easy to kind of delude ourselves that, kind of like this multiplayer solipsism, that everyone kind of has its own subjective perspective, isolated from everyone else, and it's only subjective experiences, and the rest there's not really any objective world out there. But if there would not be such an objective thing in the sense of like a common thing, if there wouldn't be such a thing as an objective truth, then by which principle, by which mechanism would one be able to encounter, observe, or experience anything at all? Because if you don't have a common denominator between your inside and your outside, or your consciousness and your physical manifestation, if you wouldn't have a mediation, then they would be completely like a dualistic, separate, isolated realities, which would not be able to relate to each other, right? This is the common mind-body problem that we have ever since since Descartes, where he's famous for saying things like, "I think, therefore I am." So he believes that thinking comes before existence, that a prerequisite to exist is first you have to think. And while people may entertain such a perspective on a kind of like a theoretical, speculative level, when you go and examine and you, for example, you practice meditation, or you have other tools and methods that allow you to experience reality, to balance the two poles, like yin and yang, or Ida Pingala, as it's called in yoga, or you can kind of, by analogy, think of it like the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. If the in-breath and out-breath, if they balance each other, there's underneath, there's just the zero, right? There's just the plus, there's the minus, and in between there's the zero. And the zero is what allows us to transcend, what allows us to go beyond duality, what allows us to go beyond the mind, the dualistic mind. Now, reason, language, cognition in terms of form, shapes, and objects is always subject to duality. So you can only speak by analogy and by metaphor, and that's why sometimes people go like, yeah, maybe I believe it, yeah, it sounds interesting, yeah, maybe not. There's no way of convincing people that there is something beyond the dualistic realm. The only way to resolve that curiosity is to go there for yourself, go see for yourself, experience it firsthand, a direct experience, and then and then you don't have to take anyone else's word on it, but you get to see for yourself. And then from there, once you have an intuitive understanding, then you can come back, and then suddenly you get to see who is just speculating and kind of lost in some degree of imagination and wishful thinking and a certain degree of confusion. And then beyond that soup, you start to pick up on certain individuals where it's like, okay, now some of the things maybe that you agreed before on a kind of like an ideological level, it's like, that sounds interesting, it sounds nice. Suddenly it's like, now I actually know what that individual is talking about. This description that the person may convey to you by metaphor, now you know, now you've been there, right? There's, let's say, for example, I used to drive motorbikes, and there's this feeling when you accelerate, just before the wheel comes off the ground, there's like a little bit of a jiggling, like a little bit of a vibration, and you're right on the edge where you're just about to lift the wheel, and the front wheel comes up into the air. And once you've been there, you will recognize it every single time. You will not miss it. It's not like, oh my God, what's happening now? No, you know. But if I'm just telling you, I'm not saying you should try it. I'm just taking an example that maybe is unfamiliar to most. If you didn't have an experience, an experiential, basically an experience of this, a first-hand experiential attestation of what is being described, it's just a theory. It's just a belief. And this is why it's so important to examine what our beliefs are, in the sense of like what our assumptions are, because once we see that we make certain assumptions over these questions, which we don't have definitive answers in the sense of like science, we have a certain, let's say, a Big Bang theory, which is more prevalent, but there's a whole spectrum of cosmological assumptions, a whole spectrum of teleological possibilities. And they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are mutually true, but they present a different point of view. Because if you are internally and self-referentially consistent in all these four things, the fourth one being epistemology. But it's really the first three ones that are key, because they already, if they are consistent, they generate a common principle, and that common principle becomes your epistemological device. It becomes a principle by which you can generate reason, like you can generate interpretation from a stimulus. Like you can use the first principle that you will encounter naturally is the linear order, right? Things like price. You have a number, you have a scale, it's linearly ordered. You can always say if something is either more or something is less. And then you can say, well, there are trade-offs, but the trade-offs are qualitative, and then they're subordinated to the price, and the price is definitive. Then the next thing is you add a dimension, you have now two components, and then you literally are dealing with trade-offs. You deal with polarity, you deal with two components that that now involve a different cosmology, because the first one, the authoritative principle, is simply basically command control. Again, if you have a good team, let's say if you are with people that you care for, that you want to support, and you care for each other, you care for each other's interest, health, safety, you recognize each other's preferences, priorities, and you want to coordinate as a team to do something together, it is a viable model to have a hierarchical order structure. It's not necessary, but many high-performance teams in sports, in work, in other competitive or pressure environments, it can work really, really well because it can be very, very efficient. The political equivalent to this is authoritarianism. And in politics, because this immunity and because so much is detached, because the decision point is so remote from the effects that is being caused, it is very difficult to get this one right. It very easily can lead to problems. But at the very minimum, we should understand the principle, understand the motivation behind it, and also understand the problems with it. The next one would be the reactionary. Somebody who says like, well, okay, there's forces acting. I don't really know. I don't believe that I can change those forces, but at least I can stand out of the rain or expose myself to the sun or do something to benefit from the structure. And that's basically just an optimizing principle that in itself, again, is not necessarily good or bad, but if it's not supervised by a higher principle, it can very easily become corrupt. For example, Taoism, with its yin and yang, essentially is dualistic, it is polar. But then you have the te, you have the unity within which this polarity exists, and the wholeness, the systemic principle encompasses the two poles. So it's not just like a bipolar debate that like we have it like George Orwell, like 1984, where you always have like a bipolar mode of reasoning always needs to have some ultimate others to know what one is by being different than the other, right? And then you always need an enemy or a contrast, and the idea there is that you always have like a thesis, and then that generates an anti-thesis, and they clash together, and then they something new comes out, and that becomes the new thesis, and then it generates some antithesis. And it's not strictly wrong. It can, within a certain playground, it could be a healthy way to explore something. But when the cost and damage becomes too large, it's far from optimal, right? And then you get to the next principle, the next epistemological principle, which is consistent with the traditional conservative position, where you essentially become a statistician. Like you make statistics about what happened in the past, and you try to recognize patterns and then extrapolate from the past into the future, and you try to predict the future based on what has happened in the past, and then you try to operate based on what seems to be desirable of the future that you predicted based on the past, right? People that are conservative, they don't reject change because they don't like things to be different. The reason why they don't like things to be different is because their prediction recipe no longer works. Because if you change reality too much, if you change the condition too much, then you no longer can be sure that your prediction mechanism works. The next one is logical positivism, that you say like, well, we have like a set of tools and a lot of parameters that we can control, like technologies that we have mastered, right? We have, to a certain extent, we can fly, we understand wind, we understand, I don't know, hydraulic power, we have combustion engines and all sorts of things. And with that we can, I don't know, let's say, control a house with a thermostat to maintain a temperature with a certain range, or control a vehicle or a plane or a boat for that matter. And we have a certain amount, a certain degree of control, but then there's all sorts of things which we have not yet mastered. And then from the logical positivist, that would be if we number them, authoritarian being the first paradigm, reactionary second paradigm, conservative third paradigm. Now logical positivism is traditionally the scientific position. That would be the fourth paradigm. The fifth paradigm is where you become more divergent. You realize that the future is not compelled by the past. The past may come with a particular impulse, but the future is still unwritten, and therefore you have multiple possibilities, and you can weigh them against each other, and you can examine, you can extrapolate with your mind especially. That's one of the beauty of us being conscious as beings, that we have this ability to say like, hey, wait a minute, let me think this through. If I do this and then go there and then follow that trajectory, where does that lead me? And then what if I instead try this one? Now, what if I jump off the cliff? No, that's not a good outcome. What if I drive into the wall? No, that's not a good outcome. What if I stay on the path? Oh, okay, maybe it's better to drive on the path for if I want to have like a healthy life. But then to a certain extent, it's like, well, if I always drive on the path, I know exactly what I'm getting, and unless I want to go back and forth, then the path is really good. But maybe I want to explore, but I know if I go away from what is well established, I have to become more careful. I cannot drive at the same speed that I would be driving on a highway. Now I drive off into a dirt road. That would not be safe, right? So I have to be more careful the more I venture forward in a less explored territory. So that'll be the fourth paradigm, where we examine different possible futures. And then we come to the sixth paradigm worldview, and this now takes us back to natural law, where we say, well, are there certain principles which are consistent with life? Are there certain bounds that we can establish as kind of guideposts to say like, well, we would like to remain within certain limits, that we would like to. Alan Watts once said that the best government is kind of like a Taoistic government. It kind of goes down a valley and it's never really on track. It just kind of wobbles along. If it goes too much to one side, it gets pushed back. If it goes too much, so it's like a gentle, elastic riding moment. It's not fixed, because if something's very fixed, it becomes inflexible. It works, and the strain becomes too much, and at some point it snaps, right? And then you have collapse, you have repercussions. It's not so easy. So it's much easier. This is also from the technology of cybernetics. There's excellent work by Stafford Beer, for example. And earlier on, we have Buckminster Fuller, where you have tensegrity, right? You have integrity and tension and a certain amount elasticity, that you maintain coherence in a way that you don't need to be exactly on point. It's like with the thermostat, right? You're too high, you kind of cool down a little bit. You're too cold, you heat up a little bit. And then you always maintain it within a certain bound. And if you deviate too much from your optimum, from your desired condition, then you increase the pressure to correct. So you can have an elastic system. But that's not all that there is, because if you deal with a constructive system, the question is, how can you construct something where by how you construct it, how you go about constructing something, that you don't suddenly accidentally end up in a situation which you didn't like, right? This is a big problem in mathematics, for example, because for the most part, mathematics kind of exists in an isolated abstract space where you can just use numbers and do whatever you want with it. And then it gets very, very difficult, very hard to create proofs. It's actually in many domains of mathematics, it's extremely hard. Or like you can solve it, you can find a solution one way, and that's a few percent of the work, and then the rest of the work is to find a proof to verify that what you did is true. This is different in the domain of constructive mathematics, because there everything is constructed from. My favorite one is by Vladimir Voevodsky. He created the univalent foundations, and then based from that you have Steve Avode, probably mispronounce his name, where they described homotopy type theory. So types that you can construct, and they are always contractible. And these types, this is now a little bit more technical, I understand, so maybe not everyone is that familiar with this degree of technical depth. But if you have a constructive approach to construct configuration spaces and bounded spaces where you say, well, within these limits, the entire range is valid, and I take this as an input to a function, and then I create a bounded function that is able to handle all these inputs that you can now choose, that you have a free parameter within a certain limit, and then that allows you to shape the behavior. It allows you to design a whole space of conditions of what kind of realm of possibility, what kind of space you want to enable, what kind of space you want to construct. And the beauty of this is the way you construct it, because you construct it from principle, that you always establish a primitive and say like, okay, this is something that I'm okay with, a degree of freedom or a resource that I want to introduce, and then with that I construct the next step. That is one way to ensure that we to eliminate some of the arbitrariness and to ensure some sort of integrity. It's not the only solution, but I found it was important to point it out here. Now, this takes us to this is the sixth paradigm worldview, where you have configuration spaces, where you have bounded systems, which are essentially invariant to its possible configurations underneath it, and you can construct things in a way where it's like, well, within these limits, you have certain criteria which are the way that they are articulated. Right? If you construct something and you always construct it by generating or producing two limits, and then deriving from those limits where the optimum is. Let's say a metaphor that I like is one of a boat, where you have the hull of a boat which displaces the water, and then you have the keel which has a weight on the bottom, and because of that weight, the boat, wherever it is, whatever the waves are doing, and however much it goes sides and upside down, it will always right itself gently towards the center. That's to me, that seems a very elegant organizing principle. And then you can take it to the next level. Then you can say like, well, now that we have something that is in a, not fixed, but in a reasonably stable equilibrium, or tends towards an equilibrium, a stable position, and at sea, now we can put a sail on top, and now we can use the sail for navigation. And even if we have a prevailing wind in one direction, of course we can just sail downwind and let us be carried. But because we have this keel, we can cut across the wind and use the sail for the wind to push us up with tacking, right? You can cut up and go against the wind. So these are then higher order governance questions where you choose. This is something that I learned from a video of Stafford Beer, where he said when he came with cybernetics, he looked at the term Kubernetes from Greek, and it was not control in the sense of, we often think of control, something with force, like a brake or like a button or something. But Kubernetes apparently came from steering, like steering a ship. So it's a different kind of control, more in the domain of guidance systems. And beyond that, because it's difficult, while we can build technologies to become more powerful, more potent, and more specialized, fierce, it's not as easy for them also to be safe. And that's why you have the seventh paradigm. The principle there is unitarity, where you try to guide things towards a state of a systemic equilibrium. Like whatever you do, you try to do it in a way to make the system more vital, vital in a sense of like that it can be more relaxed. For example, that's one criteria, that it becomes more harmonious, that it becomes more resonant with itself, that it tries to find an equilibrium. Doesn't mean that there cannot be tension. It's fine that there are tensions, as long as there is not disturbances in the sense of like that you have something that disturbs on one end, and then that causes repercussions in another part of the system. But that you find, let's say, if something is very tight and narrow, it has to be very agitated, and you have strong forces, and that creates a lot of friction. So the opposite would be to be very relaxed, so that a flow can be unfolding effortless, or in an ideal case frictionless. That, you know, like let's say if you want water to flow freely, then you want to have a large cross section, so and no obstacles in the middle, so the flow can be easy. Whereas if you have a very constrained flow, then you create a lot of pressure, you create a lot of turbulences, internal friction, and the more you try to put pressure to push more water through, the more the resistance increases. This also applies to electronics, of course, where if you run through too much electrical charge through a wire, it heats up, and then heating up increases the resistance. And what we aim for is the opposite. We want to aim for not just good conductors, but essentially superconductors. So a conductor which is so conductive that its resistivity is down to zero, that you have zero resistance, and then you can pretty much skip the tunnel. Like you can just the connection is almost free. Like, we're still limited to the speed of light and all that, but the amount of current that you can carry through becomes much higher. So what Danny proposes in this, to not impose one particular view, is like, look, for any of these principles, you can make an argument, and people that want to adhere to a particular worldview, let them make that argument. Don't tell them, oh no, you can't say that. As long as they are internally consistent, they should be able to make that argument in a way where everyone who adheres to the same worldview, they can come together and pretty, like, I think they should be able to, let's say, all the authoritarians come together, and they can have like their own principle by which they choose to govern themselves and come up with a conclusion or an opinion or a decision or a choice. And then that is contrasted by the next paradigm worldview, by the reactionary, and they also make their case. And then the conservatives and the logical positivists, and then the progressives and so on, all the way to the utopians. And then you set a constraint that while you don't need to require any particular one of them, at least several of these worldviews should be able to agree with each other. Because if something makes sense, but it only makes sense in one aspect of reality, if you think of a spectrum like a color spectrum, or the notes like do re mi fa sol la ti do, and you are consistent, but it only makes sense in a particular color, and when you go into different color, it becomes completely incoherent or disturbing or confusing. It's quite possibly consistent with that principle, but it may have inadvertent effects that maybe are not visible within that principle. So it would be good if we would get 5 of those principles to agree with each other, right? That could be a governing logic, that you can have different principles, that you can have a set of people come together and try to make a decision, but they cannot, and you cannot just stack the court and only get, I don't know, 70% reactionaries in there, because then you will end up with a reactionary decision, with a reactionary solution, and that's not necessarily in the interest of the larger public. Maybe that just happens to be consistent with some authoritative principle that they all respond to, but it wouldn't be healthy, or it wouldn't be in the side of life in the larger context of things. And then there's also an 8th principle, which I like to characterize as an inversion of control, that you can propose something, but you cannot enforce something. This will go to in a direction to advocate that updates are incremental and that they are adopted voluntarily. So, for example, in Bitcoin, one of these things is that the nodes, not the miners. So the miners are one thing. They are a service provider. They are basically running hard mathematical problems, and if they are lucky, if they find a solution, then they get rewarded for it. So that's kind of like the security function that hardens the security. But the nodes, the ones who actually operate the infrastructure, like that maintain the ledger, they cannot be forced to upgrade to a new software revision. The upgrade is always voluntary. It is possible to upgrade, but the threshold is fairly high. I think in this case it's like 95% of the nodes need to update and choose to, well, first they signal that they are willing to go for a particular upgrade, and then when it gets deployed, once 95% have upgraded their code, then the new version is active. This again, these are not just some thoughts that if we start to use code, if we start to use automation, if we start to use digital reasoning, or in the domain of mathematics also proving systems, we need to have mechanisms that are robust enough that they are leading to predictable outcomes, and ideally we encode the principles that we hold dear, whether that is a freedom, whether that is, I don't know, free choice, free speech, freedom to property, freedom of, let's say, self-determination is a fairly big one, right? That's these sort of principles should be, I mean, they need to be evaluated, but it would be good to have some basic principles, like in the US Constitution, they have the Bill of Rights. And they list a set of rights, and then it's like, yes, but beyond that, there's a bunch of other ones. I think it would be very healthy to get to a level where we can articulate essentially resolutions and proposition for solutions, or also constructions, right? We want to evolve, we want to also involve the regulatory framework to enable new things, right? Let's say 100 years we didn't have internet, we didn't have mobile phones. There was no need to govern these things since they didn't exist. So we can anticipate it in the future. We will have new ways of interacting, of communicating, of possibly trading, possibly or organizing ourselves in how we govern our lives, our livelihood, freedom, interactions. And so we want to be somewhat forward-looking in a way that we can evolve, that we can innovate, but we want to innovate safely. We don't want to degenerate just in randomness and chaos. Okay, so this is roughly what I wanted to get through, and I can highly encourage Dennis to review Dennis' presentations, especially he has some of them where he picks certain rights. For example, why free speech is so important, because it's kind of like, he says, it's like the granddaddy of many other rights, because if you have predicated of free speech is freedom of thought, because if you're not able to think, then it's kind of pointless to be able to speak and predicate, and to be thinking freely. With that comes a kind of like the freedom of belief. But then freedom of speech is also can be expanded towards a freedom of expression, that if you want to advocate something, you can do this through articulated language or writing, but it can also be through art, through culture, through dance, through different forms of manifestation. And then if you express yourself in a particular way, then you might want to interact with others that are also interacting in a similar way. So then comes like the freedom of assembly, and anyway, I find his presentations really remarkable, and going forward, I do believe his work is not sufficiently recognized today, and he also has a substantial amount of warnings and kind of identifying certain problems where he sees that. Well, things are not optimally on track, in a sense that then if that the people entrusted with operating the legal system, if they do not adhere the original principles, like David Deutsch, for example, said, the whole point of democracy or modern governments was to remove people from power without violence, right? That you, if somebody starts to misbehave, that you can that there is a process to articulate and discuss a grievance, and if it's not resolved and the people are experiencing a hardship, then if the people entrusted with providing solutions are not able to provide the solution or even improve or maybe not even maintain a certain level, then they can be there's a process to change the people with somebody who may be more suitable for a particular job. But he also makes a very strong point about that whatever people advocate, you need to let them do it and see what the result is. Like if people are entrusted to do something and they're trying to follow through with what they're supposed to do, you cannot constantly interrupt them and constantly change them and say like, well, we don't think it would have worked. And therefore, let them try. Let people give people a chance in a way which is progressive but also safe. That it's not arbitrary, not random, but that there is a room for innovation, that there is a room for exploration, and that we can structure ourselves and conduct ourselves and structure our conducts and our social organizations and our economical reality and our physical reality in a way which is harmonious with the larger nature of things, like the principles that we observe in nature. It's desirable that we conduct ourselves in ways which are in harmony with nature. And that, of course, requires us to first inspect a little bit of how much we know and understand the limits of what we don't know and what we could be possible beyond what we know, to explore the different possibilities of our reality. Because otherwise you might go to the beach and build a sandcastle and go home, and next day it's gone, and then you come up with an explanation of what happened. Maybe somebody trampled on it, maybe an animal, maybe a car drove over it, and then you do it again, and it happens again, and it happens again, and it happens again, until you discover that there are tides, and that the tides move, the shoreline moves up and down. And if you have something which is soft, either you need to build it out of something which is solid and is not washed away by the water, or you need to build it somewhere in a place which is unaffected by this particular element. So this is just an example of saying like it's very helpful, it's very much in your interest to understand the nature you find yourself in, to explore the different principles that are operational, that we are subject to throughout our lives. And the more you understand these principles, these forces, these mechanisms that are at play, the more you can either use them for your benefit, like the example with sailing, or you can find a way to shelter yourself, to sidestep a force which is not in your interest. And ultimately this can lead you to have like a more delightful, more happy, more harmonious experience. Because if you come crossways with certain principles that are acting without understanding why they are different, then it can be very frustrating, because then you end up with consequences that are different from the ones you intend. Right? If we have a model which is incorrect and we act based on an intention, but the model is incorrect, it will result in an outcome which is different from what we intended or what we anticipated. David Bohm makes this there's a video clip of him talking about the implicate order where he goes a little bit into that. Anyway, I think this was enough for today. I just wanted to give an overview over these 4 fundamental questions, the resulting epistemological principle by which we can reason, by which we can assimilate information and generate facts, how we can reason from these facts and how we can understand how others may reason different from us, so that we first get to understand how they're reasoning, what their assumptions are, how they come to a particular conclusion, also what their motivation is, where they want to go, how it's maybe different from us, and then find whether we're trying to do alternative things that are kind of, they can exist in parallel, or where there might be a convergence point if we find a way to align incentives, but it's neither one nor the other, but beyond those, at a certain point, the two can fuse together. Anyway, don't hesitate to let me know if you would like to have one area more deeply explored, or if I mentioned something. I'm trying to go through and add some of the references that I mentioned. Yeah. I hope this has been useful to you, and wish you a good day.